to Business Today. I am Siddharth Zarabi and we are starting the Secretary's Roundtable after the presentation of the Union Budget. And with me now, Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran, the Chief Economic Advisor, and Mr. Manoj Govil, the Secretary of the Department of Expenditure. Dr. Nageswaran, I want to start with you and then take that same question. You know, one of the key observations is that there is no other major economy, at least to my reading, that seems to have been able to reduce its fiscal deficit consistently post-COVID. I just want to begin by asking you to explain to our viewers what is the larger import behind this strategy at a time when growth has also slipped. So what are we driving at here?
No, I mean, the Honorable Finance Minister in 2020 promised when the fiscal deficit reached 9.2% of GDP and the consolidated fiscal deficit, including states, was more than 12%, that at least from the union government side, we would bring it down to 4.5% or lower in the 5 years. So it's very important to deliver on that promise, and that was delivered over the course of the last 5 years using conservative assumptions on GDP growth, on tax buoyancy, etc., which were consistently bettered in terms of actual outcomes. And that actually has benefited the economy, because if you look at the borrowing cost of the government of India, in comparison to interest rates in the developed world, the spread has shrunk so much compared to what it was 5-6 years ago. And imagine the counterfactual. If this promise was not met, what would have been the government of India's borrowing cost and what that would have meant to private sector interest rates? It would have been a very different scenario. So it was not something that was done at the expense of growth. If anything, it actually facilitated growth by keeping the borrowing cost low.
That's a very, very important point. I'll come back on that. But Mr. Govil, take that point forward, because when you look at the planned expenditure, the total outlay for the next financial year, it's about 50 lakh crore. Again, that's a number to be noted. Almost 25.5% of that is interest cost. And perhaps sometimes our viewers who are looking at giveaways do not appreciate the interest burden that we have. Given the fiscal consolidation strategy, what can you share about the government's intent to ensure that we continue to remain steadfast on this path?
Look, the normal fiscal deficit to GSDP ratio before COVID was 3.4% in 2018-19. Then 19-20 it increased to around 4.6. Then suddenly went up to 9.2 because of COVID. So obviously, subsequently it has been on the glide path. In the next year, we will deliver on the promise made by the Honorable Finance Minister of 4.4% of GDP. Naturally, because of this reason, the total debt in the economy for the central government has increased a little bit, and part of that reflects in the interest payments, which you see as 12.76 lakh crore in the next year. So we hope that as the debt to GDP ratio comes down, this interest cost will also come down in future.
That's a very important point, because the question that is asked, why is the government not giving so much? There is committed expenditure of this. Dr. Nageswaran, taking the broader point that Mr. Govil also spoke about, the choice of debt to GDP ratio as the sort of benchmark for fiscal consolidation rather than just rigid fiscal deficit. Explain this strategy. It's been outlined before, but restate that once.
It was outlined in the budget in July itself. And I think the important point to note here is that this gives the government more flexibility at a time of increasing uncertainties, which the economic survey also flagged. And also it is easy to think of it this way. A debt to GDP target has to have a declining deficit, whereas a deficit to GDP target ratio doesn't take into consideration what is happening to the debt burden. In fact, so this one encompasses the deficit in it, whereas the other one doesn't encompass the deficit, the debt in it. So that is a year-by-year number. But the understanding is not that, therefore, the government would let go of the deficit ratio. But if that is the case, then the debt to GDP ratio also will not necessarily come down. So the point is to give ourselves flexibility on a year-by-year basis while staying on a glide path with respect to both debt and deficit. And only when the debt ratio comes down, then the question you posed to Dr. Manoj Govil about the interest payments being high will also start to come down. So the focus is to bring down the stock of debt. in relation to GDP, such that we are able to increase the amount of expenditure latitude available to the government and not see them be taken up by the interest cost.
Well, just one quick follow-up. In the medium to long term, what would be an ideal debt to GDP ratio for a country like India?
I think it's very context specific. I think the government, if you look at the FRBM statement placed in the parliament along with the budget documents today, the government is looking at, from the union government perspective, achieving a debt to GDP ratio of about 50% by 2030.
Plus or minus 1% is the flexibility that's perhaps
right.
given. Dr. Govil, I want to come to the role of the states, because we are discussing the union budget, but you can't do it without the states. Are there lessons for state economies to draw from what the union is now doing with regard to their own fiscal consolidation and the fact that we have seen a trend towards a certain kind of giveaways, which have raised concerns around whether that is going to distort the budget of these states even further?
So the union government has been encouraging the states to invest more on capital investment, improve the quality of expenditure. If you might have seen the Niti Aayog report recently about the fiscal health of states. So the idea from union government is to encourage the states to put more money in the capital side, and we have a scheme which is called the special incentive scheme for capex to states.
Yes.
And we have been running it for the past few years. Next year also we have, I think, planned 1.5 lakh crores for this, and the results are encouraging. Part of that scheme's expenditure is on untied basis and a part based on the various reforms. And we have seen that many states have done reforms, they have improved their capex, and recently an RBI report also came about the state finances, and the state debt to their GSDP ratio on aggregate level has also declined somewhat. So we hope that this process will continue.
Dr. Nageswaran, in the time that I have left with you, I just want you to speak about growth once again. In the context of what the budget has done for the new tax regime and the expected sort of spending surge it may lead to a consumption boom, is there a correlation we can draw between that and the consequences for increased GDP growth?
Of course. I mean, the idea of putting more money in the hands of the people is to boost their boost their spending power, consumption, which would flow back into higher investments by corporates when they see demand visibility there. So it can set off a virtuous circle, as I mentioned yesterday in my remarks after the economic survey. Yes. So clearly, I think this definitely has indeed, if anything, increased the chances of the GDP growth number moving towards the upper end of the range that I had outlined in the economic survey yesterday.
So 6.8% and thereabouts.
Yeah, I said the range was between 6.3 to 6.8, and the budget has definitely enhanced the possibility of the number being closer to the upper end of the range than towards the middle or lower end of the range.
Dr. Govil, I want you to respond to some of the post-budget questions that have been raised. One of them is the likely impact of the pay commission award that will happen. Is that factored in? Is that expected to have any sort of change on the projections?
So the pay commission has been recently announced by the government. Now it is still to be set up. The terms of reference are still to be firmed up. A process of consultation has started with the state governments, with the major ministries, including Ministry of Defence, Ministry of Home, DOPT. So we hope that probably in the next couple of months we should be able to get the terms of reference finalized. Once that is done, the commission will start its work. Depending on how long it takes, even if it takes 1 year, from let us say April 25 to April 26, so the recommendations would not come by the time that we start formulating for the next budget. So while the impact will be there on the next budget, but in some sense we don't know the true impact unless we have got the recommendations.
Absolutely. One final point. Deregulation, the message that's been picked up from the economic survey and a very clear mention in the budget today. Couldn't it have happened faster? Why wait for another committee? Because there are multiple previous committees.
It is not that the appointment of the committee will necessarily preclude this actions being taken by various state governments, and which can happen on an administrative basis. But the purpose of the commission is to also take a holistic look at across different ministries, and also the committee will look into collaborating with the state governments as well. So that doesn't preclude the possibility that actions can be taken on the basis of what has been identified. And as I mentioned yesterday as well, it is not as if states and the union government have not been doing anything on deregulation. They have been doing that. It is to move to the next stage. So I don't think the appointment of the regulatory high-level committee and the pursuit of deregulation are not mutually exclusive. They can happen in parallel.
Okay. Dr. Nageswaran, Dr. Govil, thank you very much for your time with us today. We'll be back with other budget makers. Do stay tuned in. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Joining me is Vivek Gupta, partner at Deloitte. A big bang budget, I must say. Firstly, I'm going to start off by asking you, are you happy with the announcements made